A little before dawn on the 17th of December, 1968, a blue Volvo station wagon sits at the edge of a pine stand off a red clay road in Gwinnett County, Georgia. It is cold. The trench beside it is already dug, about 3 feet deep and 8 feet long. Next to the trench sits a box, built of plywood and fiberglass, a little over 3 feet high, and 2 air tubes run out of the top of it into the dark. I have gone back to that clearing more often than I can easily explain, because the thing everyone remembers about this case is that a young woman was buried alive in that box and left in the ground to die. And the box in front of me argues, in every detail of how it was built, against the thing everyone remembers. It has a battery, it has a fan, it has a light and water and food, and a pump to carry away the wet. It was not built to end her. It was built to keep her breathing. Her father raised $500,000 in used $20 bills and had it packed into a suitcase almost the same day it was demanded. The man who buried her had spent the previous months building ventilated boxes at a university marine laboratory in Miami, under a name that was not his. The woman who helped him would become the first woman ever placed on the FBI list of the 10 most wanted fugitives. When the first attempt to hand over the money went wrong, the kidnappers panicked and fled and left $500,000 sitting on the ground. The only reason anyone found her alive is that the man who put her in the ground telephoned the FBI and told them where to dig. Of the entire $500,000 ransom, all but about $760 was eventually recovered. And the man who buried her walked out of prison after 10 years, was pardoned, became a licensed physician, and was arrested again, decades later, smuggling cocaine inside a box packed with concrete. Every one of those things is documented. None of them is the strangest part. This is the story of a family that built its fortune selling the American dream by mail. $10 down and $10 a month, and of the daughter they buried in the ground to get $500,000 back. It is also the story of a crime designed, from the first nail, to keep her breathing, and of how the money that marked her closed the case so completely that the memory of it got the one fact that mattered exactly backward. I want to start at the box before anyone is inside it, because the box is where the whole misunderstanding begins. Before we go on, one quick thing. Subscribing helps build a community around stories like this. It rewards the work behind them. Chapter 1. The box in the pine trees. Look at the box for a moment before you think about the girl. Everything you need to know is in how it was made. It is roughly 7 feet long and about 3 feet across. The shell is plywood, reinforced with fiberglass. The kind of work you would do if you spent your days around boats and marine tanks and knew how to make a thing that water could not easily get into. 2 ventilation tubes run from the lid up through the soil to the open air. Inside, wired to a switch, there is a battery-powered fan to push air down one tube and pull it up the other. There is a small lamp. There is a jug holding about 3 gallons of water with a tube to drink through. There is food. There is a pump, run off the same battery, to draw off any water that seeps in. There is even a muffler set into the air passage so that no sound made inside the box could travel up the tubes and be heard by anyone walking past above. That last detail is the one I keep returning to. A man who wanted a woman dead does not build a muffler. A muffler is not for killing. A muffler is for a live person who might scream, buried in a place where a scream would be a problem. Every choice in the design assumes the person inside is going to stay alive long enough to matter. That is the fact the story lost. The version that survived, the version in the headlines and the paperback titles and the half-remembered summaries, is buried alive and left for dead. It is a good line. It is built for a thumbnail and it is built for a shutter, and it gets the crime almost exactly wrong. The person who designed this box did not want a body. He wanted a hostage who could be handed back. A dead hostage is worth nothing. A live one, in a box only he could find, was worth $500,000. So the box is not a coffin. It is a machine for keeping a hostage alive at the lowest possible cost and the lowest possible risk of being found, for as long as the negotiation took. It is a cold thing to look at, and it is cold in a very particular way. Not the coldness of a man who wants to kill, the coldness of a man who has thought about a living human being purely as a container for money, and engineered accordingly. By the standards of ordinary cruelty, this is something stranger than cruelty. It is care in the service of extortion. The water was there so she would not die of thirst before her father paid. The fan was there so she would not suffocate before her father paid. The light was there, and the muffler, and the pump. For the same reason, every part was there. Not to comfort her, to preserve the asset. There is a grim logic to it that runs all the way down. A kidnapper who kills his hostage has thrown away the only thing of value he was holding. The whole scheme depends on the family believing, right up to the moment of payment, that the person will come back. So the box had to do more than hold her. It had to hold her in a condition that could be proven later to a terrified father deciding whether to trust a note from a stranger. A live hostage is leverage. A dead one is a murder charge and nothing to bargain with. Every switch and tube in that box was an answer to that single commercial fact. And the box was not cheap, in effort or in nerve. Someone had to design it, source the materials, assemble it without being noticed, transport it, and dig a trench in a Georgia pine wood in the dark. That is a great deal of work to point at one person, which raises the only question that matters about the box. Why her? Why this particular 20-year-old, 200 miles from where the box was built? The answer was not in Georgia, it was in Coral Gables, in a name that had been printed on brochures and billboards across Florida for 30 years. The box is where the misunderstanding begins. But the box did not come out of nowhere. It was built by a specific man, with specific skills, aimed at a specific family, because that family had something almost no other family in Florida had. Money that could be moved in a single afternoon. To understand why the box was pointed at Barbara Mackle, you have to understand what her father and her uncles had spent 30 years building, one mailed brochure at a time. Chapter 2. $10 down. The Mackle fortune was built on a simple and slightly unbelievable idea, that you could sell a person a piece of Florida they had never seen, on an installment plan, through the mail. It began with Frank Mackle, the father, who founded a construction firm in 1908 and moved his operation to Miami before the Second World War. When he died in 1941, the business passed to his three sons, Elliot, Robert, and Frank Jr. For decades, the three of them ran everything together, out of one shared office, making every decision as a set, so closely joined in the public mind that Florida simply called them the Mackle brothers, as if they were a single person. During the war, they built for the Navy, an enormous project down in Key West. After the war, they turned to houses, and here the scale starts to become hard to hold. They put up something like 10,000 homes across South Florida in the post-war years. Modest, affordable, mass-produced houses for families who wanted a place in the sun. And then, in the 1950s, they found the thing that would make them genuinely rich. They would buy enormous tracts of undeveloped Florida land, cut it into lots, lay out entire planned communities on paper, and sell those lots to strangers all over the country and overseas, on time, for a small amount down and a small amount every month. Through a company called General Development Corporation, they created Port Charlotte, Port St. Lucie, Port Malabar, Whole cities conjured onto former scrubland and swamp. The pitch was a full-page advertisement and a promise. $10 down, $10 a month, a piece of Florida of your very own. Think about what that requires. It requires a person in Ohio or Michigan or Germany to send money, month after month, for a lot they have very often never stood on. It requires them to trust a photograph and a map and a name. And trust, at that distance, is a manufactured product. It has to be built as deliberately as any house. The brochures were part of it. The package flights were part of it. The paved first streets and the model homes were part of it. Small proofs offered to a wary stranger that the place in the advertisement was real. The Mackles were, at bottom, in the business of selling certainty to people who had every reason to be uncertain, and they were extraordinarily good at it. The Mackles became masters of manufacturing that trust. They flew prospective buyers down on cheap package trips. They built model homes and paved the first few streets so the place felt real. They sold, by some accounts, tens of thousands of home sites this way. There is something worth slowing down over here because it sits underneath the whole rest of the story. The fortune was built on selling faith in a place that did not fully exist yet, on the willingness of ordinary people far away to believe that the Florida in the brochure was the Florida they would get. Years later, long after the brothers had moved on, the land sales business that grew out of this model would face a serious federal reckoning over what buyers were told and what they actually received. The honest version of the family's rise includes that shadow. The dream sold by mail was, for a great many buyers, exactly as advertised. For some, it was a photograph standing in for a swamp. In 1962, the brothers left General Development after a dispute at the top and started again under a new company, Deltona. And Deltona built on the same model, and it built even bigger. Deltona Lakes, Marco Island, most of which they bought and set about turning into a resort city. By the late 1960s, the three Mackle brothers sat at the head of an enterprise valued in the tens of millions of dollars, with communities scattered across Florida and a name that meant something to anyone who read a Sunday newspaper. Robert Mackle, the middle brother, lived in Coral Gables with his wife Jane and their children. He was, by any measure a stranger would use, a rich man. Rich in a particular and dangerous way. Rich enough that $500,000 in cash was a sum he could actually produce, quickly, if he had to. That is the detail a kidnapper needs. Not just wealth, but liquid wealth. Money that can be moved before anyone can stop it. And 200 miles north, in a motel room in Georgia, that rich man's 20-year-old daughter was lying sick with the flu, a long way from any of it. If you have made it this far, you should probably subscribe. It helps build a community around stories like this one. It rewards the work that goes into them, and it is free. Chapter 3. Room 137. The Roadway Inn sat in Decatur, Georgia, a short drive from the campus of Emory University, and in the middle of December 1968, it was where Barbara Jane Mackle was waiting to go home for Christmas. She was 20 years old, a junior at Emory, and she was sick. A strain of flu that people were calling the Hong Kong flu was moving through the country that winter, and it had swept through the university hard enough to overwhelm the campus infirmary. Barbara had it. So her mother Jane had driven up from Florida to take care of her and to bring her home. The two of them had taken a room at the motel, away from the crowded dormitories, to wait out the worst of it, room 137. In the early hours of the 17th, around 4 in the morning, someone knocked. The person at the door said he was a police officer. He said there had been a car accident and that Barbara's friend, Stuart Woodward, had been hurt. It was the kind of message that goes straight past a mother's caution because it is built to. You do not run a background check on a man who says someone you love is bleeding on a roadside. Jane opened the door. There were two of them. One was a large man holding a sawn-off shotgun. The other was smaller, in a ski mask, and in the dark and the shock, Jane took that second figure for a young man. It was not. It was a woman named Ruth Eisman Shire, and the disguise held. What happened next was fast and practiced. They forced their way in. They subdued Jane and Barbara both, pressed a chloroform-soaked cloth to them, and bound Jane and left her on the floor of the room. Then they took Barbara, sick and half-conscious, out to a car waiting in the dark. A blue Volvo station wagon, and they drove away with her. Jane Mackle worked herself free and got to a telephone, and here is the first of the terrible ironies that run through this case. In the instant she made that call, the entire Mackle fortune became worthless. Every dollar the brothers had built, every community sold by mail, every acre of Florida, none of it could do the one thing she needed done. None of it could tell her where her daughter was. A mother on a motel floor with a phone in her hand is the same as any other mother in that moment, rich or poor. The money would matter enormously in the days to come. Right then, it could not help her at all. The car carried Barbara north and east, out of the city, about 20 miles, to a stand of pine woods off a quiet road in Gwinnett County. There the ground had already been opened. The trench was waiting. The box was waiting. They had planned this with care. The abduction had a script. The lie about the boyfriend was chosen because it works, because it moves a careful person to open a door at 4 in the morning without thinking. The location had been scouted. The hole had been dug in advance. Nothing about the night was improvised. Consider how much had to go right for them, and how much rehearsal that implies. They had to know Barbara was at that motel and not in a dormitory, which meant they had watched. They had to have a car, a disguise, a weapon, and a story that would survive the first 30 seconds at a chained door. They had to have the burial site already prepared, 20 miles away, so that the drive from the motel led somewhere and not nowhere. A crime like this is mostly the part nobody sees. The 4 minutes at the door were the visible tip of weeks of quiet, patient work. And for Jane Mackle, the mother, the horror did not end when the car pulled away. It began there. She was bound. She was recovering from chloroform, and she had to free herself before she could do anything at all. Then came the phone, and the police, and the slow realization spreading outward through the family and the FBI that a young woman was simply gone, somewhere in the dark, and that no one on earth knew where. For a period of hours there was no note, no demand, no contact, only the fact of her absence. A parent can steel themselves against a threat they can see. There was nothing here to see. There was only a made bed, an open door, and a daughter who was not in the room. And that, again, is the thing to hold on to. This was not rage. It was not a killing that got out of hand. It was a project, weeks in the planning, executed by two people who had built the tool and rehearsed the approach and chosen the target for a specific reason. The reason was 200 miles south, in Coral Gables, and it could produce $500,000 in a suitcase. What they had built to hold her in the meantime is the thing to describe next. Because the box was not only a place to keep her, it came with instructions. Chapter 4. The Capsule. There was a letter inside the box. It began by telling her not to be alarmed. The letter was typed, and it was, in its way, a masterpiece of a certain kind of mind. It told Barbara that she was safe. It told her she was inside a fiberglass-reinforced capsule, that she had air and water and food, that the equipment around her would keep her alive. And it told her, falsely, that she was buried deep beneath the water table, and that if she panicked and broke the seals of the box, water would come in and she would drown. That last part was a lie. She was under about 18 inches of soil. But she had no way to know that, and the lie did a job. It kept her still. A person who believes that any struggle will flood the box does not struggle. That is the man who built this thing. He reassures and he threatens in the same breath, and both are aimed at the same goal, which is a calm, quiet, living hostage who does not damage the equipment or draw attention. His name was Gary Stephen Christ, and he was 23 years old. He was, by every account, extremely intelligent, and he had been in trouble his entire life. He had started stealing as a boy. He had done time. He had escaped from a California state prison, and during that escape, another man had died. And then, remarkably, he had reinvented himself using the name George Deacon. He had talked his way into a job as a technician at a marine science laboratory attached to a university in Miami, working around tanks and boats and fiberglass, being paid a real salary, trusted with real equipment. It was there, in that laboratory, that he had quietly built the capsule. And it was there that he had met the woman who would help him use it, on a research trip some months before. He chose the Mackle family deliberately. By his own later account, he went looking, in a library, through the records of wealthy families for a target whose money could be turned into ransom. In the language of the ransom trade, he was not choosing a victim so much as underwriting a loan against a stranger's love, with the stranger's child as the collateral. He was not driven to Barbara Mackle by passion or grievance or any connection to her at all. He selected her the way you would select a line item. Her father was rich in the liquid, movable way that a kidnapping requires, and that was the whole of it. I want to be careful here because it is easy to make a man like this sound like a genius, and the fascination with his intelligence is part of how the case gets misremembered. He was clever. The box proves he was clever. But cleverness pointed at a sleeping 20-year-old with a shotgun is not brilliance. It is the most ordinary thing in the world wearing a lab coat. The engineering deserves attention only because of what it tells us about the intent. And the intent, written into every tube and switch, was to keep her alive until the money came. There is a bleak irony in where the skill came from. A marine laboratory keeps living things alive in sealed, controlled environments. That is the entire point of the work. Tanks and pumps and monitored air, the careful maintenance of organisms cut off from the world outside. Christ had spent his days there learning exactly that discipline, and then he had turned it, without apparent difficulty, from keeping specimens alive to keeping a hostage alive. The knowledge did not change, only the container did. So consider what it actually was, this capsule. It was a life support system built by a man who had studied how to keep organisms alive in sealed environments, repurposed to keep one specific human being alive in the ground for as long as a negotiation might take. The air, the water, the light, the pump, the muffler, the calming and threatening letter. Every element solved a problem in the same equation. How do you store a person underground, undamaged and undiscovered until they can be exchanged for cash? The answer to that equation was about to be tested, because at some point on the morning of the 17th, they closed the lid, and they filled in the trench and they left. And Barbara Mackle, 20 years old and sick with the flu, was alone in the dark, under 1.5 feet of Georgia clay, with a small light, a fan she could hear, and a letter telling her not to move. She would be down there for the better part of 4 days. Subscribe if you want the next one. It costs nothing, and it takes a second. Chapter 5, 83 Hours. What she remembered most, afterward, was the sound of the dirt. She could hear it landing on the lid above her as they filled the trench back in, and she could hear it grow fainter and farther away with each shovelful, until the sound of the world closing over her stopped altogether, and there was only the hum of the fan and her own breathing. That is the moment I cannot get past. Not the abduction, not the trial, not the strange second lives that came after. That, the sound of the dirt getting quieter, and then the quiet. Everything that follows comes from her own account, the one she gave later in her own words. It deserves to be kept plain and not decorated, because it does not need decorating, and because she is the only person who was there. The light did not last. By her account, the small lamp gave out within a few hours, and after that the dark was total. The kind of dark you do not experience above ground, where there is always some faint source, some gray. There was none of that. There was the fan, and the water tube, and the case of candy, and the letter she could no longer read, and time, which underground has no shape at all. She was 20 years old. She had been, a few days before, an ordinary college junior, worried about final exams and a bad flu, and getting home for Christmas. Now, she was a body in a box, listening to a fan, trying to work out whether it was day or night above her, whether her family knew, whether anyone was coming. She held on to specific things. She thought about Christmas. She thought about her family, about being home, about ordinary rooms with people in them. She prayed. By her account, it was faith and the picture of a normal life waiting for her that she reached for, over and over, in the dark. As the hours ran together and her body grew stiff and cold and dehydrated, she did not know that she would be down there for roughly 83 hours. Not knowing how long is its own particular torture. A person can endure a great deal if they know when it ends. She had no end to count toward. There is a temptation, telling this part, to reach for large words, to make it operatic. That is a mistake, and it is a kind of disrespect. What happened to her in that box was not operatic. It was small and slow and unbearably lonely. A young woman lay in the dark under the ground for 3.5 days and did not know if she would ever come out. And she kept herself alive in her own mind by thinking about her mother and her father and Christmas. There is nothing to add to that. Adding to it would only be for our benefit, not hers. The body, meanwhile, was doing what a body does when it is cold and still and short of water. She grew stiff. She lost feeling in places. She lost weight she did not have to lose. The 3 gallons of water had to be rationed against a thirst she could not see the end of. And there were smaller torments that never make the headlines but that anyone can imagine if they let themselves. The problem of relieving herself in a sealed box. The problem of an itch she could not properly reach. The problem of a mind with nothing to do but count, in a place where counting led nowhere. These are not dramatic. They are the actual texture of what she endured, hour after hour, and they are worse for being so ordinary. What is remarkable, reading her own account, is how little self-pity is in it. She was frightened, and she says so. But the thing she reached for was not despair. It was the picture of a table with her family around it. She built that picture and held it and returned to it, and it held her, and it proved enough to keep her from breaking in a way that might have cost her the discipline the letter demanded. She stayed still. She stayed quiet. She stayed, against everything, alive. While she lay there, 200 miles to the south, a machine of a very different kind was starting to move. Her father had received the ransom note. The FBI was involved. And Barbara Mackle, The man who had sold the American dream to strangers by mail for 30 years was now trying to complete the most important transaction of his life. He was trying to give $500,000 to the men who had his daughter, and he was finding, to his horror, that even that was not simple. The money was ready. Getting it into the right hands without getting Barbara killed was about to go badly wrong. Chapter 6. The $500,000 Suitcase. Robert Mackle had built a life out of closing deals. This was the one he could not afford to lose. The ransom note had reached the family through a jar buried in the yard of the Coral Gables house, found on instructions phoned in by the kidnappers. The demand was $500,000 in used $20 bills. It came with a photograph of Barbara holding a sign, proof that she had been alive when the picture was taken. And it came with the thing every kidnapper needs the family to feel, which is the sense that the clock is already running and that any wrong move ends with a dead child. Money itself was the least of Robert Mackle's problems. That is the strange, cold fact at the center of the case, and it is the fact the whole crime was built on. A family of ordinary means would have spent days it did not have trying to raise that kind of cash. Borrowing, selling, begging a bank. Robert Mackle assembled $500,000 in used 20s and had it packed into a suitcase with the speed of a man who has written large checks his whole life. The fortune the brothers built by mail, $10 at a time, could now be spent $500,000 at once, in an afternoon, in cash. The same liquidity that made Barbara a target was the thing that let her father meet the demand almost before the ink was dry. But having the money and delivering it are two different problems, and the second one nearly killed her. The instructions sent the family to a drop point near Biscayne Bay in the middle of the night. The money went out. And then the plan came apart over something no one could have scripted. A resident in the area, hearing an outboard motor running in the dark during a stretch of local burglaries, did the ordinary, responsible thing. They called the police. A patrol car came to look. The officers had no idea a kidnapping was underway. No idea that the boat they were disturbing belonged to the people holding a buried girl. No idea that a suitcase with $500,000 in it was sitting out in the dark a few yards away. It did not matter that they did not know. The effect was the same. The kidnappers saw the police, panicked, and ran. And in running, they left the money behind. $500,000, the entire ransom, abandoned on the ground because a neighbor heard a motor and a squad car came to check. Think about where that left Barbara. She was in the box. Christ was the only person alive who knew where the box was, and Christ had just been spooked into flight, believing the family had brought the police down on him, which was the one thing the note had warned would get her killed. The accident of that patrol car put her closer to death than any deliberate act in the entire case. Not cruelty, not a plan, a coincidence. A resident being a good neighbor at 4 in the morning, and a girl underground paying for it. Robert Mackle understood what had happened, and he did the only thing left to do. He went back through the channel the kidnappers had opened, and he tried to reassure them. He put word out, by the means available to him, that the police had not been his doing, that he was still willing to pay, that he wanted only his daughter back. He was, in effect, apologizing to the men who had buried his child, because reassuring them was the only path to getting her out of the ground alive. There is no version of that which is not obscene, and he did it anyway, because a father with a daughter in a box does whatever the box requires. Every instinct a wronged man has, to accuse, to demand, to threaten, had to be swallowed and reversed. He had to make the people who had taken his child feel safe. He had to sound calm for the benefit of criminals. The fortune could produce the money in an afternoon, but it could not buy him out of that particular humiliation, and he submitted to it without hesitation. because the alternative was a daughter who never came home. A second drop was arranged, and the family went through it with the particular dread of people who have already watched the plan fail once. This time the handoff itself worked. The money went out and Christ collected it. But even then, the thing nearly came apart a second time. Walking back toward his parked car with the ransom, Christ saw two police officers, panicked again, and ran, dropping most of the money on the ground and keeping only a rifle. One of the officers gave chase and fired 2 shots. Both missed. And that near miss, a stray patrolman almost shooting a fleeing man in the dark, was very nearly the end of Barbara Mackle, because the man being shot at was the only person alive who knew where she was buried. He escaped, doubled back, and recovered the money. Christ had his $500,000. And now everything, absolutely everything, depended on whether a man who had just been paid would keep the one promise that could not be enforced. Subscribing is how stories like this one keep showing up in your feed. It is free, and it is what keeps them coming. Chapter 7. Where to dig. Here is the fact the entire case turns on. After Gary Stephen Christ had the money, he told them where she was. He did not have to. That is the thing to sit with. He had the $500,000. He had a head start. The only person on earth who knew the location of that box was him. And a buried girl in a Georgia pine wood is not a thing anyone finds by luck. He could have taken the money and vanished, and let her run out of air in the dark, and the odds of her ever being found in time were close to nothing. Every incentive of self-preservation pointed toward silence. Instead, he made a telephone call. He contacted the FBI, and he gave directions, rough ones, to a wooded area near Duluth, northeast of Atlanta. And that call is the reason there is a rescue here at all, instead of an exhumation. Agents converged on the area he described. There were, by the accounts that survive, something like 100 of them, working through the woods, trying to match vague directions to actual ground. And then someone found it. Not the box at first, the air tubes. 2 lengths of pipe running up out of the earth into the daylight. The same tubes that had been keeping her breathing for 3.5 days, now the thing that marked the grave for the people trying to open it. They dug by hand. They were careful because they did not know exactly how she was positioned or how much air she had left, and because a careless shovel could have done what the whole ordeal had not. There is a detail in the design that mattered even here at the end. The box had a rear compartment behind a bulkhead, holding the battery and the wiring, and the first efforts to open it went into the wrong part, so that even the rescue had to reckon with how carefully the thing had been built. They worked around it. They reached the main compartment. They got the lid open. She was alive. After roughly 83 hours in the ground, Barbara Mackle came up out of the box into the pale December afternoon, stiff and filthy and dehydrated, weak and blinking against a light she had not seen in 3.5 days, and alive. By the accounts that survive, one of the first things she managed to say to the agents pulling her out was that they were the most handsome men she had ever seen. It is the kind of line that should not be able to exist in a story like this, and it does. And it tells you something about who she was that no amount of description could. The reflective pause here writes itself because it is almost unbearable. Her survival, when it came down to it, did not turn on the money. It did not come down to her father's fortune, or the FBI's 100 agents, or the engineering of the box. All of those things mattered, but none of them would have been enough. She was found alive for one reason, and one reason only. The man who buried her decided to tell someone where she was. Her life was, at the final step, a gift from the person who had taken it from her. There is something almost intolerable in that, and it is true. And the story does not work if you look away from it. An FBI account of the case made the point plainly in retrospect. During the manhunt, there had been a moment when Christ might have been shot. And had he been killed, Barbara would almost certainly have died in that box, because Christ alone knew where it was. The one thread her life hung by was the continued breathing of the man who had put her underground. Ransom kidnapping had haunted the country for a long time by then, and it carried a specific dread. The great precedent, the one every parent of means thought of, was the Lindbergh case decades earlier, the child taken for money and found dead, the ransom paid for nothing. That case had made ransom kidnapping a federal crime and had put the FBI at the center of every one that followed. The Mackle kidnapping arrived inside that long shadow, and for 3.5 days it threatened to end the same way. That it did not. That this time the buried child came up out of the ground alive was close to unprecedented. And the reason it broke the pattern was not superior policing or a father's wealth. It was a phone call from the kidnapper. The thing that separated this case from the nightmare it resembled was the decision of one man to talk. She was safe. She would recover fully, with no lasting physical harm, which is its own small miracle given where she had been and how long she had been there. But the two people who had done this to her were still out there, with most of $500,000, and the second half of the case was only beginning. One of them was about to make history on a list no one wants to be on. Chapter 8. The first woman on the list. Gary Stephen Christ did not enjoy his $500,000 for long. He ran for the water, which was the one instinct that made sense for a man who had spent his recent life around boats. He bought a small boat, paying for it, by the accounts that survive, with $20 bills, using yet another false name. And he set off to cross the whole peninsula by water. His plan was to run the inland canals and locks across Florida, over Lake Okeechobee, and down the Caloosahatchee River to the Gulf, and from there make for a rendezvous and, eventually, Europe. It was an ambitious route, and it put him in front of a series of lock keepers, which turned out to be the flaw in it. It did not work, and it did not work because of the locks. At one of them, a lock tender did not believe Christ's story about the boat's registration being lost, worked out that he had told the same story at every lock before it, and called the police. From there, the pursuit was fast. Boats and a helicopter closed in as he came out of the Caloosahatchee into Charlotte Bay, near the mouth of the Peace River, and Christ beached the boat and fled on foot into the mangroves of Hog Island, off Punta Gorda. Agents and local deputies surrounded the island. After about 12 hours in the swamp, in water that, by the accounts that survive, held alligators and snakes, 2 Charlotte County deputies caught him, and nearly all the money was still with him. There was around $17,000 in his pockets and another $480,000 in the boat. Add the roughly $2,200 he had spent on the boat itself, and of the entire $500,000 ransom, only about $760 was ever unaccounted for. Sit with that figure for a moment against the scale of what he had set in motion. He had studied wealthy families in a library, engineered a life support capsule, buried a young woman for 3.5 days, extorted one of the largest ransoms of its era, and thrown an entire region into panic. And the amount he actually got away with, the money that was his and gone when the counting was done, came to about $760. It was, by the standards of the ambition behind it, almost nothing. The $500,000 had never really been money he could keep. It had been a number the family could produce fast, which was the only quality that mattered to the plan, and it went back into evidence bags almost intact. The other one took longer to find. Ruth Eisman Shear was, by the standards of the people who usually turn up in stories like this, an unlikely fugitive. She was in her mid-20s, born in Honduras, the daughter of refugees, a graduate student in marine biology, at a university in Miami. She had met Christ on a research trip and had joined his plan, and she had been the second figure at the motel door in the ski mask that made a mother think she was looking at a young man. After the crime, she scattered, moving under false names, taking ordinary jobs, a waitress here, a car hop there, trying to disappear into the enormous anonymous middle of the country. On the 28th of December 1968, the FBI placed her on its list of the 10 most wanted fugitives. She was the first woman ever to appear on it. The list had existed since 1950. For 18 years it had been an all-male institution, a gallery of bank robbers and killers and men on the run. Ruth Eisman Scheer was the first woman the Bureau ever decided belonged among them, and she earned the place by helping to bury a college student in a box. What finally caught her was the most ordinary thing imaginable. She applied for a job. The position, by the accounts that survive, required fingerprints, and she gave them, because refusing would have drawn more attention than complying. Those prints went into the system, and the system matched them, and in March of 1969, after 79 days on the run, she was arrested in Norman, Oklahoma. She had crossed the whole country and built a fragile new life out of aliases, and it ended because a job application asked for her fingerprints, and she could not say no. She had done everything a fugitive is supposed to do. She had moved, changed her name, taken quiet work, drawn no attention, and a single sheet of paper, filled out to earn an honest wage, undid all of it in an afternoon. There is something quietly enormous in that detail. The great machinery of the manhunt, the most wanted list, the national attention, and in the end what closed the net was a form. The same bureaucratic surface that the Mackles had used to sell land to strangers, paperwork and records and files, was the thing that reached out and identified a fugitive who had done everything else right. She had outrun the country. She could not outrun a fingerprint card. If you are still watching this far in, you are exactly who these are made for. Subscribe, and I will keep making them. Chapter 9. Mercy. The trials were where the law finally drew its lines, and the lines it drew are stranger and more humane than the crime deserves. Gary Stephen Christ went on trial in Georgia in the spring of 1969. At that trial, by the accounts that survive, he tried to convince the court psychiatrist that he was insane, presenting himself as a superior kind of human being. And it did not take. Kidnapping for ransom was a capital offense in the state, and the prosecution went for it. They wanted the electric chair, and by the ordinary logic of the case, they had every reason to expect it. A man had abducted a young woman at gunpoint, buried her alive in a box, and extorted $500,000 from her family. If any crime short of murder ever pointed straight at an execution, this was it. And the jury did not do it. They convicted him, without much difficulty. But when it came to the sentence, they recommended mercy. And the reason they recommended mercy came from the witness stand, from Barbara herself. She testified. And in her testimony was the fact that had saved her life, the fact that Christ had telephoned and told the FBI where to dig. The jury heard, from the young woman he had buried, that the man in the dock had also been the reason she was alive to sit there and describe it. That single act, the one decent thing inside an indecent crime, was enough to move 12 people to spare him the chair. The judge imposed life imprisonment instead. And I keep returning to the shape of that because it is such an unusual thing for a crime to contain. Most terrible cases offer nothing to weigh on the other side. This one did. The same man built the box that nearly killed her and made the call that saved her. And the law, confronted with both facts at once, could not bring itself to kill him. The mercy in the verdict is a direct descendant of the mercy, if that is even the word, in the crime. He kept her alive to sell her back, and telling them where she was kept him out of the chair. The commercial logic of the box reached all the way into the sentence. There is a further, quieter point to make about the ransom figure that hung over the whole trial. $500,000 was an enormous sum in 1968, and it was among the largest ransoms of its era. It was not, whatever the retellings sometimes claim, the largest in the country's history. That grim record had been set years earlier and would be broken again later by other crimes. What made the Mackle ransom notable was never that it was the biggest number. It was that a single family could produce that number, in cash, in an afternoon. The scale of the demand was a measure of the family, not of the crime. Ruth Eismanshire's path through the courts was shorter and quieter. She pleaded guilty. The judge, in sentencing her, made a point of distinguishing her role from Christ's, describing her as the secondary figure rather than the principal, and gave her 7 years. She served a portion of it, was paroled, and was deported to Honduras, where by the accounts that survive, she returned to an ordinary private life, married, and raised a family, at a great distance from the box in the Georgia woods. The first woman ever to make the most wanted list went home and became, again, a person no one had heard of. 2 people, 1 crime, 2 very different reckonings. One went to prison for life, and one went home to Honduras. And the distance between those outcomes was the distance between building the box and standing at the door in a borrowed disguise. And beyond the courtroom, the thing that had made all of it possible, the fortune, was still standing, and would have its own long reckoning to come. The model the brothers had ridden to wealth, selling Florida to strangers by mail on the strength of a brochure, did not stay uncomplicated forever. In the decades after the kidnapping, the wider business of selling undeveloped Florida lots to distant buyers drew hard federal scrutiny over the gap between what those buyers were promised and what some of them received. The Mackle brothers had moved on from the company most associated with that reckoning years before it came, and the details belong to a different account than this one. But it is worth naming because it completes the shape of the thing. The same machinery of trust and paperwork and distance that built the fortune, that let a family turn faith in an unseen place into $500,000 in cash, was the machinery that made the family a target, and, in a different form, the machinery that would later be questioned. The fortune and the crime grew out of the same soil. That is a slower story, and it belongs at the end, alongside the strangest turn of all, which is what became of the man who built the box. Chapter 10. What was buried? Gary Stephen Christ did not stay in prison for life. He served about 10 years. He was paroled in 1979, and the parole was controversial, and the words used to justify it have not aged well. An official involved in the decision offered the public the reassurance that there was nothing in the files to suggest Christ was violent or dangerous, and that if he ever did commit another crime, it would not be a crime of violence. Read that against what he had done, and it is a remarkable sentence. A man who buried a living woman in a box was being described, a decade later, as fundamentally non-violent. In one narrow technical sense, the official was even right, and that is the most unsettling part. Christ would reoffend. It would not, in the ordinary meaning of the word, be violent. It would just be another cold, engineered scheme, because his second act is almost harder to believe than his first. After his release, he was, in time, pardoned by the state of Georgia, the record wiped clean enough to let him try for the one profession that trades entirely on trust. He went to medical school. And in due course, Gary Stephen Christ, the man who had buried Barbara Mackle alive, became a licensed physician, and for a period actually practiced medicine, treating patients at a clinic, holding people's lives in his hands with their full consent. It did not last. His past was not a secret that could stay buried, and a problem with how he had accounted for his own history caught up with his license, and it was taken away. But pause on the fact of it before it slips past. A parole official had promised the public that this man's next crime, if there ever was one, would not be a crime of violence. And in the interval, the system had not merely released him, it had certified him. It had handed him a medical license and the trust of strangers who lay down in front of him. The box in the pine woods and the doctor in the clinic were the same man, and for a while the second one was entirely legal. And then, years later, the story closed its own circle in a way no writer would dare invent. In 2006, Christ was arrested again. The charge was smuggling, cocaine and people both. And when investigators looked at how he had been moving the drugs, they found the old signature. The cocaine had been concealed inside a box packed with concrete. He had built a container again. He had, one more time, engineered a vessel to hold a valuable thing hidden from the people looking for it. The mind that made the capsule in the Marine Laboratory in 1968 was still, nearly 40 years later, making boxes. Let me stop the chronology there, because the tour is over, and what is left is the thing underneath it. It would be easy to say that this is a story about a rich girl who got buried alive and a monster who did it, and to leave it there with a shudder. That is the version the title promises, and the version most of us carry, and it sits at an angle to what the record actually shows. This is not a story about a man who buried a woman to kill her. It is a story about a man who buried a woman to keep her, and about how completely we misremembered the difference. What strikes me, having walked the whole length of it, is that nearly every cruel choice in this case was bent toward keeping Barbara Mackle alive. The air, the water, the light, the muffler, the letter, the phone call to the FBI. Not one of those was mercy. Every one of them was logistics, the careful maintenance of a living asset until it could be exchanged for cash. And that is, somehow, worse than simple murder. And also the only reason she is not dead. The horror and the rescue are the same set of decisions seen from two sides. I do not think there is a clean way to hold that, and I have stopped trying to find one. What survived was Barbara. She came out of the ground whole, recovered fully, wrote her own account of the 83 hours in her own words, married, and lived a long, private life well away from the cameras. What survived was the fortune, for a while, though the land sold by mail would face its own hard questions in the decades after. What did not survive was the version of the crime that the box itself refutes. And what did not survive, for the man who built it, was the second chance a parole board once described in such confident, hollow terms. So go back to the pine stand, one more time, a little before dawn on the 17th of December, 1968. The blue station wagon at the edge of the trees, the trench already dug in the red Georgia clay, the box beside it, plywood and fiberglass, a little over 3 feet high, with 2 air tubes running out of the lid into the cold. On the first pass, that box is a grave, and the tubes are the last obscene detail of a murder. By now, you know better. The tubes are the reason there is a rescue at the end of it. The box is not the thing that was built to kill her. It is the thing that was built to keep her breathing until the money came. And it did exactly that, and a telephone call finished the job the box began. She went into the ground breathing, with a light and a fan and 3 gallons of water, and after 83 hours, she came out of it breathing. The rest is what we chose to remember instead. This is the kind of work this channel exists for. Subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.